name's Jessica Corneille. I'm a research psychologist and I focus on spontaneous spiritual awakenings. And I also work for several other charity organizations that deal with the intersection between science and spirituality. So today I'm going to be discussing spontaneous spiritual awakenings. And some of you might be wondering, what is a spontaneous spiritual awakening? So a spontaneous spiritual awakening, according to my own definition, is a strong experience characterized by a profound sense of connection, communion, or complete non-dual oneness, merging with the infinity and ultimate reality, cosmic consciousness, or the divine. As you might have imagined, my profound interest in this kind of experience emerged from my own spontaneous spiritual awakening, which occurred in this flat up here some years ago, 7 years ago to be precise. I went to bed an atheist. I went to bed and I had a very profound lucid dream. And when I woke up the next morning, I opened my eyes to a new day and to a new reality. And this is what would have later shaped everything that I do in life. So it was a very profound experience. And what happened is, as I scanned around the room, as I opened my eyes and woke up from this lucid dream, I noticed the sheer aliveness of everything around me in the bedroom. All the inanimate objects seemed to have come alive and acquire this lifelike quality. What I later learned is called the Brahman in Hinduism. A sense of divine interconnection with everything and everyone in the universe was deeply felt within my body. It wasn't a thought idea, it wasn't conceptual, it was very much lived and experienced, and it was almost cellular, is how I come to term it. It was as though a veil had been lifted from my eyes and I could finally see reality for what it truly was, which is in its sheer miraculousness, if that's even a word. And that experience completely transformed my life. And I had an incredible sense of bliss, of unconditional love, a love that I'd never experienced before, despite having grown up full of love, luckily, in my life. And this incredible sense that consciousness lies at the fundamentals of the universe. So those are sort of the main characteristics of a spontaneous spiritual awakening. And let's say that they're almost the golden thread that ties through all of these different kinds of emergences and spiritual awakening experiences. So again, a connection or oneness with the universe, sense of bliss, peace, love, an experience that it is noetic, so it's deeply embodied rather than a thought, and that it's ineffable, so that it's very difficult to explain these experiences through words because they almost occur on a level whereby symbols are not required and language is just a symbol through which we can interpret the world around us. And these experiences are considered realer than real by those who have them. So lots of people ask me, how do I know if I've had a spiritual awakening? You just know. And the experience often feels like you've unpeeled a layer of reality and you're finally able to witness the objective truth around you, right? But other characteristics that might not always present themselves in a spontaneous spiritual awakening or in a spiritual awakening more generally, gratitude and curiosity and creativity, sensitivity and reduced anxiety, especially around the fear of death, is very common, and then altered time and space perception are very common as well. So going on to the less kind of reported symptoms emerging from these experiences are those that are more somatic or physical, such as perceived changes of temperature in the body. And many people report an experience of heat rising drastically through the spine, from the base of the spine to the crown of the head, or even of tingling in the hands and in the feet, and also in the third eye, in the point between the eyebrows. And these can also be interpreted as electric sensations or prickling or tickling or tingling. Much similarly to my experience, luminosity can sometimes be reported. In other words, there can sometimes feel as though light is emerging from the body or emanating from different parts of the body. When this happened to me, I had no idea what chakras were. I didn't know anything about energy centers in the body. And yet I experienced very, very viscerally this sense of light emanating from my heart space, my third eye, and the crown of my head, which was incredible. Some people report disruptions to the digestive and reproductive system. So some people feel the need to purge, and others have spontaneous orgasms. And then others might have odd contortions in the body, or might come into spontaneous mudras, so hand gestures, or spontaneous body movements, like what we would call in yoga asanas. In rarer cases, people experience psi phenomena or paranormal experience, such as encounters with different entities, which is quite rare, to be honest, in spontaneous awakening experiences, less rare in psychedelic experiences. But what is actually pretty common among these least common experiences of psi phenomena are synchronicities. So that certainly was the case in my own experience. I was flooded by this kind of abundance around me where things were happening to me nonstop. And I could almost see the connections form around me and things were manifesting for me. It was very, very odd, particularly as I had not been exposed to these kinds of concepts before. And then for others, there can be a sense of viewing oneself from outside of their body, an out-of-body experience, what we call in scientific terms autoscopy. And occasionally you get telepathic experiences occurring. So people feeling that they can sort of understand what the other person is thinking or feeling. But yeah, so these experiences, whether short or long in peak duration, almost always lead to very profound and long-lasting changes to well-being. So people report an increased physical and mental well-being, increased pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors. In other words, people acquire, as already mentioned, a higher sense of empathy for others, of compassion, of gratitude, and pro-environmental behaviors. In other words, people feel more connected to nature and thus more likely to engage in behaviors to protect nature, such as, even dietary changes like going vegan. That's quite common. And of course, that's also coupled with a higher sense of purpose and meaning. So people usually report a sense of changes in religious or philosophical views. Again, relating to my own experience, I was an atheist before. And then after the experience, I became spiritual, but not religious. So I still don't belong to a particular dogmatic type religion, but I now know that there's more than meets the two eyes and the five senses. And because of all these transformations and changes, people often report changing their career paths, and usually towards a career that is more likely to facilitate positive change within society. So there's usually moving away from materialism and religiousness towards a sense of mission and selfless service, and towards love-based values in life. And actually, this was just a brief way of representing that through my own research that was published a couple of years ago. We found that almost all these experiences were considered predominantly positive in the long term, even when there were fewer positive responses in the short term, meaning that if held responsibly and with care, these experiences can almost always be interpreted as very, very positive, even when they're slightly negative or even very difficult initially, because people find themselves stripped of their existing ideologies, belief systems, and that can be very bewildering or confusing for individuals. So we've looked at the subjective positive experiences, but actually we're starting to find out more and more through the work of transpersonal psychology and also psychiatry using psychedelics that mystical experiences, in other words, spiritual awakenings the are linked to a decreased risk of committing suicide among suicidal individuals. And they're also linked to the improvements in treatment-resistant addiction and also depression and anxiety among non-psychedelic participants in these studies. And actually, going back to the addiction side, spiritual awakenings have been found to have a 3 to 4-fold increase, or individuals have been found to have a 3 to 4-fold increase in abstinence following their spiritual awakening experience, which is huge. And even Carl Jung proposed spiritual awakening as a means of releasing oneself from addiction. And even in this 12-step programs and Alcoholics Anonymous programs, spiritual attainment is considered the ultimate sort of goal within these programs in order to release oneself from addiction. So it's quite powerful. And these are not necessarily things that anybody knows. But yes, once you start digging a little bit, you start to find out that these experiences are much more appreciated within science than we would originally expect. And of course, through psychedelics, we're finding that mystical experiences or spiritual awakenings are correlated with increased improvements in treatment-resistant addiction as well, depression, and reductions in anxiety, hopelessness, and fear of death among patients in palliative care. So individuals I think these studies were done with patients with cancer who are in hospices, and they found that individuals had a far less anxiety following their mystical experiences. So not only the psychedelic experience, but the stronger the spiritual awakening element, the stronger the rate of release from anxiety and hopelessness and fear of death. And these experiences can be preceded by no apparent trigger, in other words, spontaneous and random, or they can be preceded by periods of homeostatic imbalance. So through starvation, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, following sleep deprivation, or following or during sacred sexual intimacy or celibacy, in other words, through the manipulation of the ojas, what they would refer to in Hinduism again. So the libido energy, once you start playing or manipulating libido energy, it seems to sort of trigger these kinds of experiences to some extent or another. Contact with nature was really high up on the list of people who reported, many people reported contact with nature as being a really important preceding factor to their experience. Spiritual literature and content was also reported highly as a preceding factor. Obviously, contemplative practices such as meditation, yoga, breath work. But what was really interesting is that psychological turmoil or trauma seemed to be the most significant preceding factor to these experiences. So most commonly reported in my study, but also in several studies before mine. So there's some consistency there. So I won't go too deep into the causes and theories, but in our own study, the one that I published with Dr. David Luke, we found that temporal lobe lability, i.e. the symptoms that are indicative of epileptiform disturbances in the temporal lobes, seem to be highly correlated with the intensity of the spontaneous spiritual awakening. In other words, temporal lobe epilepsy might be associated with spontaneous spiritual awakenings. And as you can see here, temporal lobes are associated with language and emotions and visual memory, which might explain why some people have, profound changes in emotional states and so on and so forth. We also found that trait absorption, or the level at which one's attentional involvement occurs without effort or control, i.e. the level of engrossment that one might have without trying or focus in something, was also highly associated with the spontaneous spiritual awakenings. So there could be certain personality traits or even traits that we can kind of build on and attune to that might trigger these experiences, such as praying, chanting, being in community and doing something like drumming. I went to a drum circle last night and I didn't have a spiritual awakening then, but I'm sure that doing that for hours and hours on end might trigger something, a state of transcendence or of flow. And there are several theories. These are two of the most, popular ones, where the default mode network, the network of brain associated with a typical sense of self, in other words, what we would refer to as the ego, once those brain regions are diminished in activity, there seemed to be an arising, not awakening necessarily, but an arising attunement with oneself, with a sense of ego transcendence and with a greater sense of self. So the default mode network reducing in its activity might be correlated with an increased mystical experience or spiritual awakening component to an experience. And we find that psychedelics and meditation are both associated with lowering of the default mode network, which is why this theory is now very popular, because we're starting to find patterns emerging in neuroscientific research. And then a less sort of scientific approach, but one that is actually pretty valid, is this idea that endogenous dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, might be released at a time of a spontaneous mystical experience. It's been postulated to be released at the time of birth and of death as well, and to reside in the pineal gland. But this is all to be determined. These are just theories, and we haven't actually been able to find out we know that endogenous DMT, which is this psychedelic chemical, resides in our bodies. We know that, we've been able to show that scientifically, but we've not been able to show where it resides, where it comes from, and we don't actually know what it does. But we would imagine that might be correlated to spiritual awakenings of a spontaneous nature. And what's really interesting about this is, in our own study, we found, and I'm not going to show you all the graphs, obviously, but we found that spontaneous spiritual awakenings were most similar to DMT and psilocybin experiences compared to all other altered states of consciousness, whether they be triggered by psychedelics or completely endogenously without the use of psychedelics. So I think we compared spontaneous spiritual awakenings to about 15 different altered states of consciousness. And just to reiterate, spontaneous spiritual awakenings seem to be most similar to psilocybin and dimethyltryptamine in their depth of experience and in their phenomenology. And this is interesting, not least because the proposed healing methods of DMT and psilocybin are associated with the same healing sort of modalities of spontaneous spiritual awakenings. Why is it so important for us to talk about these experiences and understand them better? Incredibly, there haven't been very many studies observing the rate of these experiences within general populations, but several have come up, including a recent one that I collaborated on, which is about to get published. We found that these experiences actually seem to be more common than originally expected. So in a study from 2002, which involved 1,509 participants, 41% claimed to have had a profound religious experience or awakening that changed the direction of their lives. And as I mentioned in our study, when we asked individuals whether they have ever, while not on any mind-altering substances, had sudden mental events that involved strange changes in perception or ecstatic feelings, 45% of 3,135 participants reported to have had this. And bearing in mind that in both studies, these were individuals who were not recruited to take part because they had had a spiritual experience, right? So these are general populations. So really, really random, as though you were to take 3,135 or 1,509 participants off the street randomly. What's really interesting is that 15% of 3,135 participants reported that they had had an unexpected experience of a strong sense of oneness, a spontaneous spiritual awakening that may have been preceded by a meditation, for instance, or not. And that results in 470 participants, or 1 in 6 or 7 individuals who took part in our study. That's quite a lot of people. And with a growing interest in psychedelic use and in meditation around the world, these numbers are expected to go up. These numbers are expected to rise. So many people ask me the same question. Do you think that there is a paradigm shift occurring in the world whereby people are starting to come to the realization of their own true nature? And I always say, I mean, it's quite evident that this is happening at a higher rate now because we have the internet, people are sharing more information, more and more people are engaging in these kinds of practices that are linked to spiritual experiences. And so, yeah, it's very likely that these experiences are going to soar in their rate across the world. And this is problematic because health systems are still really poorly equipped to understand and deal with these experiences. If you go to a mental health practitioner, with having had an experience like this, even if it was positive and led you to acquire all these pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors that made you better than you were before as an individual within a society, you're more likely to get diagnosed with a mental health disorder. And whilst parallels are evident, so these experiences can be linked to certain mental health disorders such as bipolar disorder or other psychosis-inducing disorders, the experience, I believe, should be interpreted as an experience in its own right that has the possibility of inducing long-lasting, profound, transformative changes, positive changes to one's life. And so it needs to be held with much more care, with much more, and be much more held, better held by clinicians and mental health and medical health practitioners. And in 1994, a new diagnostic chapter in the manual that is usually used as a determining factor for different mental health disorders, a new chapter was introduced called the religious or spiritual problem. And that was meant to sort of help individuals having these experiences to not be diagnosed with a mental health disorder, but it's still it's lacking in so many ways because it only really includes individuals who are part of a religious framework already, who interpret their experiences from a religious standpoint. So it completely excludes those like myself who have had the experience outside of a spiritual or religious sort of framework. And even besides that, the chapter is not really used, we found, by clinicians. And I believe this is because of a lack of spiritually informed clinicians. People don't tend to really know that these experiences exist. And that's also compounded by a lack of research in this area. and also by the stigma attached to these experiences, which disable individuals to actually come forward and talk about them openly. And also due to a very limited, very Western-centric understanding of what it means to be normal and what it means to exist and have a normal human existence in this sort of world. Another thing I just briefly want to touch on is that I believe that yoga and holistic practitioners and teacher trainings should also include modules on these experiences and their possibility. The experience is almost always positive, as we've found and as other studies have found, but they can also be quite difficult and challenging and can lead to a series of negative effects if they're not supported appropriately. And I really, really feel strongly that, these sorts of systems should also have support networks in place should somebody within the classroom have spontaneous spiritual awakening emerging from contemplative practices. So in summary and in conclusion, these experiences are quite common, have been found to be quite common. They are expected to increase in prevalence across general populations in the world. The experiences are not presently accurately held within clinical and medical health systems, and individuals are usually considered to have a mental health disorder if they present themselves with these experiences, despite them being shown to have subjective and objective positive effects if held appropriately. And I really feel strongly that we need to change things, because these experiences can lead us to bring forth beautiful qualities in the world that I think are so desperately needed, such as those of love, of unconditional love, of cooperation, and of oneness. And I thank you all for listening. And I hope I didn't go over time, but thank you very much. And if you'd like to contact me, feel free to email me. Here's my email address. We recently also published a book which I contributed to, where scientists and academics tell their stories of spiritual awakenings. And I think this is quite telling at how prevalent these experiences are and how poorly they're supported also within workspaces. So I encourage you to buy the book and read it, because it's very beautiful. So thank you, everybody.
Jessica, thank you for an insightful presentation.